Okay, last short talk, minimising pesticide loss from farms. So, principles. Pesticide loss is driven mostly by runoff, both dissolved pesticides in solution and bound to soil particles. It's no surprise then that most studies that examine tillage and compaction also find that pesticide losses to the environment are reduced in line with runoff and soil loss. The rate of pesticide loss is proportional to the rate at which it is applied. Makes sense. Timing of pesticide application in relation to runoff events can make a big difference. Objective monitoring for pests should inform pesticide strategies and applications. And the last one, there's considerable variation in the off-farm effects of different pesticides. So, rate of application. We need herbicides. Without herbicides, we would be largely reliant on tillage for weed control, and we would have suffered terrible losses of what is the ultimate finite resource, which is soil. Conserving soils, particularly those good enough to grow crops, and there's not many of them, it's important for everyone's future. So that said, there are a number of things that can make significant differences to how much pesticide leaves farms. Good consistent weed management over time is critical. This will usually mean a singular focus on eliminating weeds so that they never get a chance to set seed. Letting a cohort of weeds produce seed can undo years and years of good weed management. So it's likely that in high weed pressure situations, we're going to require the use of some residual herbicides, and the residual herbicides are the ones that have potential for larger off-farm impacts. We also need residual products to work within crops where we can't and don't want to get machines in for tillage. In time, the number and spectrum of weeds, if your control is good, the number and spectrum of weeds means that growers can transition to more use of knockdown herbicides and less of residuals. So the rate of residual use decreases over time with consistent good weed management, and that should be the aim on every farm. So there are lots of good examples of where this has occurred, particularly in the cane industry, where there are many farms where the routine use of residuals in ratoon cane is not required anymore, and a lot of people are getting away without herbicides in ratoons at all, or at least in parts of the farm where the weed pressure is lower. Of course, there are also examples where the opposite is true, and growers have found a need to reintroduce strategic tillage operations to control weeds that are very hard to kill. A good example of that is feathertop rhodes grass in the grains industry, or in some areas that are resistant to herbicides. We don't have much of that in the north yet. The other measures are about how we apply some products. So for residual herbicides, it's the use of band spraying that dramatically reduces loss. This means that, when I say band spraying, I mean that instead of applying the herbicide to 100% of the cropped area through a conventional boom spray, it's only applied in a band over the crop rate, which is typically ends up being between 30 and 50% of the area. So it's a big reduction in how much actually goes out. The remaining area still needs to have weeds controlled, and this is done via nozzles that are carefully directed to the inter-row space and often covered with a shield or a hood to make sure that none of the knockdown herbicide gets on the crop, because that'll damage it. So it's a bit of trouble to go to. It's not that difficult to achieve though, and it has a terrific result. Other examples, there's lots of examples in agriculture of where targeting pesticides reduces or eliminates loss. So a good example of that would be stem or bunch injection of insecticides in bananas, which has virtually no loss. So the chart you're looking at here robs a bit of data from a study published by Aaron Lewis, who does know a bit about this stuff. The y-axis is the amount of herbicide measured in runoff from irrigated sugarcane. There's two herbicides, and they are atrazine and metribuzin. The blue band is the runoff, the active ingredient runoff from a conventional 100% coverage application. The orange band is an application which is a band covering 41% of the area of the crop row. You can see there's a pretty dramatic reduction in loss and the reduction in loss is actually greater than just it's greater than 60%, which is how much less product went on. That has often been reported when bands are put onto crop that's grown on mounds in rows. So often reported in sugarcane, often reported in cotton. So many studies also indicate that the risk of pesticide loss decreases with time from application. The important factor here is the time between application and the first rainfall event capable of causing runoff. So in Queensland, a period of 3 weeks between application and runoff event has been shown to reduce the risk quite a lot. In practice, this means doing everything possible to get herbicides on the ground before the wet season, or to allow plenty of time between application and irrigations. Unfortunately, no matter how hard you try, there will be times when unforecast rainfall beats you. And there are also some cropping situations where the risks are inherently high. One example is applying residual herbicides in a grain sorghum that is planted into low cover situations. So sorghum's typically planted around the start of the wet season. So in central Queensland, we're talking about Christmas time, January. So if you plant sorghum, get a residual herbicide like atrazine or esmetolochlor onto the ground. Sometimes the storm rains will arrive before you've had enough time to reduce that risk. And in those situations, if you had to plant into a low cover situation, which is unavoidable sometimes, then there may be runoff. There's a higher risk there. So when I say monitoring, the practice we like to avoid is the temptation for a routine sort of prophylactic application of pesticides. In other words, it could be a situation where I'm not totally sure if I need it, but I probably will, so I'm going to apply it anyway. Examples of this might be spraying fungicides for foliar diseases on a calendar basis, so weekly, fortnightly, whatever, or applying insecticides for soil-borne pests when they might not be present in sufficient numbers to warrant control. So, obviously, it just stands to reason that if you do the monitoring and find out that you don't have sufficient pressure, then you can avoid having to use it. Something that we've not really done a great job of to date is considering the physical and chemical attributes of pesticides and what that means for potential impact on off-farm environments. So if I use myself as an example, I've been focused on the most cost-effective control of pests, in those situations where I've had to be. And there may have been some situations where I could have chosen different products to reduce environmental risk while doing the same job on pests, but to be honest, I just didn't have that knowledge. And most agronomists are focused on the efficacy, the control job at hand, and we haven't tended to be very well educated when it comes to some of these physical and chemical attributes of some of the pesticides we use. So there's an example here looking at two fairly common residual herbicides, esmetolochlor and pendimethalin. So both control very similar weed spectrums and can often be substituted one for the other. You could choose to use one or the other without much of an impact in most cases. The rate or volume applied is similar and the ecological toxicity is similar. But pendimethalin has very low solubility and it also binds pretty strongly to soils. In fact, it binds really strongly to soils to the point where it's considered immobile unless the soil actually moves. So there are commercial agronomists and cane farmers in particular now that are choosing to use pendimethalin because there's lower risk of the product moving in runoff water, even though there are some other desirable attributes of esmetolochlor which make it better to use. Now, there are a great deal of situations, well, there are not a great deal of situations like this where the advantages are so clear cut, but there are some opportunities, and I'm mentioning it now because it's an area that I think will probably get a lot more focus in the next few years. So I'm finished on pesticides. The last thing I'd say in summary is that you might have noticed a bit of a common theme through each topic that we've discussed today, whether it's sediment, nutrient or pesticide, and that is that focusing on keeping soil where it's supposed to be underpins much of the management scope we have when it comes to minimising off-farm impacts. Doesn't matter which pollutant we're talking about. In grazing systems, manage for good land condition, and to do that you need focus on livestock and not just pastures, the both of them. And in cropping systems, low tillage, high cover systems, some emphasis on soil health. All right, thank you.